The staff joked about cripples and charity cases, never realizing the man in flannel was the CEO. Jonathan Rain adjusted the worn baseball cap, pulled low over his eyes as he pushed open the door to Carter's Diner. The familiar bell chimed above his head, but not a single employee glanced his way. He took a moment to assess the atmosphere. The diner had once been a thriving, friendly establishment, a local favorite he had poured his heart into building. But lately, something fell off. Customer reviews remained stellar, yet employee turnover was increasing, and profits at the flagship location had inexplicably dropped. Take a second to subscribe. It really helps. Thanks. Now back to the story. Jonathan had created Carter's Diner from the ground up. 15 years of hard work, of cultivating a space where people felt like family, had paid off with 4 successful locations. But recently, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. He had been too busy with expansion and investor meetings to notice it firsthand, but a recent anonymous complaint had made him decide to investigate. He had to see it for himself. Dressed in faded jeans, an old flannel shirt, and 3 days' worth of stubble, Jonathan blended in. His outfit was intentionally forgettable, an attempt to remain unseen in the crowd. He didn't want anyone to recognize him. Not yet. It was time to observe, not influence. "Table for one," asked the waitress without even looking up from her notepad. "Counter's fine," Jonathan replied, deliberately roughening his voice. He slid into a stool at the far end of the counter, where he could observe the entire operation. The lunch rush was in full swing. Waitresses rushed between tables. Line cooks shouted orders, and the cash register chimed steadily. Everything appeared normal on the surface. But something didn't sit right. He began to notice the little things. The indifference from the staff, the strained smiles, the hurried movements, as if the employees were simply going through the motions, disconnected from the work they were supposed to be passionate about. Jonathan sipped his coffee, hoping for answers. What had gone wrong? Jonathan leaned back on his stool, watching the rhythm of the diner unfold around him. The hum of the busy kitchen and the clink of silverware were oddly soothing, yet his unease only grew. This was the place he had built, the space that had once thrived with warmth and energy. But now, the buzz felt forced, like a performance being put on by employees who no longer cared. The waitress, Megan, moved swiftly between tables, her movements mechanical. She didn't smile as she served her customers, just mechanically placed plates in front of them, muttering the usual phrases. The laughter that once echoed throughout the diner was missing. Instead, there was a dull quietness to the air, only broken by the occasional loud voice from the kitchen or the jangle of a passing order. Jonathan tried to blend into the background, listening to snippets of conversations as he sipped his coffee. A table near the window spoke about their day, their kids, but it was a distant chatter, the kind of small talk that felt empty. Jonathan wondered how long it had been since he'd truly paid attention to his own staff, his own customers. He'd been so focused on the business side of things, the numbers, the expansion, but it was the people who had made Carter's Diner what it was. Or at least it had been. A sudden crash brought Jonathan's attention back to the counter. One of the busboys had dropped a tray of dishes. The sound of breaking glass rang through the diner. Jonathan could feel the tension in the air as the kitchen staff muttered complaints under their breath, and the busboy, red-faced, scrambled to clean up the mess. "Don't worry about it," came a voice from the corner of the kitchen. It was George, the oldest member of the staff, who had worked at the diner for years. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the frantic energy around him. Jonathan watched George move slowly, yet gracefully, to assist. There was a quiet dignity in how he worked, a stark reminder of the values Jonathan had once instilled in this place. It was clear, not everyone had lost their sense of purpose. But why had so many others? Jonathan surveyed the diner, feeling the weight of what had changed. It wasn't just the indifference of the staff or the lack of energy. It was a deeper, more insidious shift. The place that had once been vibrant with genuine care now felt like a well-oiled machine, running on autopilot, devoid of the warmth and personal connection it was known for. The employees, once enthusiastic about their roles, now appeared as if they were simply going through the motions, counting the minutes until their shifts ended. As the hours passed, Jonathan noticed how the interactions had changed. The waitstaff moved quickly but without grace, their smiles stiff and mechanical. They served the food with the same expressionless faces, never pausing to chat with regulars or engage in any conversation beyond what was necessary. It was efficient, yes, but lacked the human touch that made the diner special. The regular customers, once greeted by name and treated like family, now sat quietly at their tables, not looking up until their meals arrived. Jonathan's eyes landed on Clara, the manager. She was standing by the counter, reviewing the schedule, her focus entirely on the paper in front of her. He'd known Clara for years, hired her herself. She had always been a competent leader, someone who could handle the pressure of a busy shift with ease. But today, she was distant, preoccupied with the numbers and schedules, completely unaware of the subtle decay happening in her restaurant. He caught a glimpse of Matt and Jenna, two of the younger servers. They stood together, whispering and laughing quietly as they exchanged glances. Jonathan's instincts told him that they weren't laughing about anything good. He had seen that look before, an undercurrent of disrespect that was so common among employees who no longer cared about the bigger picture. They only cared about themselves. This was the new normal, a place that had lost its soul. And Jonathan realized for the first time that it was up to him to bring it back. But the question was how? The bell above the door chimed again, snapping Jonathan out of his thoughts. He glanced up to see Emily, a regular customer, wheeling herself into the diner. She was in her late 30s, with bright eyes that belied the challenges she faced daily. Jonathan had seen her around often, always with a kind word and a warm smile, despite the fact that she was wheelchair-bound. She had become a familiar face at Carter's Diner, one of the patrons who had helped make the place a community, not just a business. But as she rolled up to the counter, Jonathan noticed something that made his stomach twist, a subtle shift in the energy of the room. Matt and Jenna, standing near the register, exchanged glances as Emily approached. Jonathan couldn't hear their conversation, but the looks they shared spoke volumes. Their body language was dismissive, their eyes flickering over her in that way Jonathan had learned to recognize over the years. The way people like them look at those they feel are beneath them. Emily ordered her usual, a grilled chicken salad and a cup of coffee, and took a seat at one of the booths. Jonathan continued to watch, a growing unease settling in his chest. He could see Matt and Jenna whispering again, this time glancing at Emily as she waited for her meal. Jonathan had been in the business long enough to know that the dynamics in the back of the house affected everything. It wasn't just about how food was prepared or orders were taken. It was about the atmosphere, the respect for the people who came in, regardless of who they were or what they might need. When Emily's meal arrived, she smiled at the waitress, who seemed to give a half-hearted attempt at a smile back before walking off. Jonathan could feel the tension in the air, but it wasn't just the staff. It was something darker, more insidious. The disrespect wasn't just casual. It was something that had woven its way into the very fabric of this place. Jonathan knew, then, that this wasn't just about fixing service or cleaning up a few bad habits. It was about changing the culture entirely. Jonathan had only just taken another sip of his coffee when he heard it. A burst of laughter, too loud and too harsh, cutting through the soft hum of conversation. He glanced over and saw Matt and Jenna, standing near the counter, their heads tilted toward each other in what seemed like a private conversation. Jonathan could see their faces, twisted in amusement as they whispered, but his attention shifted to Emily, who had just finished her meal and was preparing to leave. The laughter continued, and it was then that Jonathan saw the moment clearly. The two of them were laughing at Emily. His stomach sank. They weren't being subtle about it either. As Emily reached for her wallet, struggling to pull out a few crumpled bills, Matt gave a barely concealed snicker. Jenna leaned in, her voice low but audible enough for Jonathan to hear. Looks like the queen of the diner's finally paying for her meal. I bet she needs help with that too. Jonathan froze. The cruelty in their words was like a slap. Emily, oblivious to their mocking, had started to count her change at the register, her cheeks flushing slightly as she realized she didn't have enough. Jonathan's heart tightened as he watched her struggle, trying to find the last few cents. Megan, the cashier, had noticed the situation unfolding, but instead of offering any help, she rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath. Jonathan's grip tightened on his cup, his mind racing. He watched as Emily, clearly embarrassed, turned to Megan and asked if she could leave the tip until she could return with the remaining money. Without missing a beat, Megan shot her a cold look. Jonathan didn't need to hear the rest of the conversation. The snickers, the dismissive attitudes. He'd seen enough. Matt and Jenna had crossed a line, not just in their treatment of Emily, but in the way they had made it so publicly degrading. This wasn't just poor service. This was something far worse, a complete lack of humanity. As Emily gathered her things and made her way to the door, Jonathan felt a wave of anger. He knew this wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, and it had to stop now. Jonathan sat quietly at the counter, his coffee now long forgotten, as the reality of what he had witnessed began to sink in. The laughter, the mockery, it wasn't just the behavior of a few immature employees. It was a symptom of something much deeper. The diner, the place he had built with his own two hands, had become a space where disrespect and cruelty thrived under the surface, where the values of kindness and family had been pushed aside for efficiency and convenience. The weight of it settled heavily on his shoulders. For years, he had poured his energy into making Carter's Diner a beacon of community. He had put systems in place, streamlined operations, and made decisions that pushed for growth. But somewhere along the way, the people had been forgotten. The ones who had helped make the business successful, the staff, the customers, had become a mere backdrop to the bottom line. Jonathan's mind kept replaying Emily's face, the way she had quietly accepted the mockery, the way she had tried to cover her embarrassment with a forced smile. He had built Carter's Diner to be a place where people could come as they were, no matter their walk of life, and be treated with dignity. But now, he saw how the restaurant had been reduced to a business that catered to the few at the expense of the many. He couldn't shake the image of Matt and Jenna, their smirks and casual cruelty. They thought they could get away with it because no one was paying attention. But Jonathan had been watching, and he knew now that things had to change, or the diner he loved would become just another soulless establishment, one where profits were made at the cost of human decency. The problem wasn't just with Matt and Jenna, though. It was with the entire culture he had inadvertently fostered. He could feel the pull of his own moral compass, urging him to act, but he hesitated. The decision before him wasn't easy. It was about more than just firing a few bad employees. It was about taking a hard look at the culture he had allowed to thrive under his nose. And for the first time in years, Jonathan wasn't sure if he could fix it. Jonathan returned the next day, still wrestling with the decisions that lay ahead. He couldn't ignore the creeping sense that the issues at Carter's Diner ran deeper than he initially thought. As he settled into his usual booth, keeping his disguise on, he noticed the atmosphere had shifted. The staff was less animated, their interactions terse, as though they were walking on eggshells. The diner, once full of life, now felt like a stage for rehearsed performances. His eyes found Matt and Jenna again, standing by the register, speaking in hushed tones. They seemed to have no fear of being overheard, even though they'd clearly noticed Jonathan's presence. As he observed them, he caught snippets of their conversation. They were speaking about the customers they had dealt with the day before, the same ones they had mocked. Their words were laced with disdain, laughing about charity cases and cripples that had the audacity to enter the diner. Jonathan's stomach turned. This wasn't just one or two isolated incidents. It was a culture of disrespect that seemed to permeate the staff. And it wasn't just Matt and Jenna. Clara, the manager, had been walking past the conversation without even a glance, too preoccupied with the day's schedule to intervene. Jonathan's heart sank. Clara had been one of his most trusted managers, and yet she seemed blind to the toxic undercurrent festering in her own restaurant. As the morning wore on, Jonathan kept his distance, making careful observations of the entire operation. More subtle signs began to emerge. The way certain staff members ignored the elderly customers, the cold, calculated manner in which the new hires followed the script without ever showing any warmth. The more Jonathan watched, the more it became apparent that this wasn't a result of a few bad apples. It was an environment where disrespect had been normalized. The worst part? He hadn't seen it. He hadn't been paying attention when the signs first began to show. And now, in the quiet of his booth, Jonathan realized just how much damage had been done. This wasn't just about the employees, it was about him too. The culture had slipped through the cracks of his own negligence. Jonathan watched Clara, the manager, as she bustled around the restaurant, her eyes scanning the floor, checking schedules, and making mental notes for the day. She was efficient, yes, but something was missing. Her usual warmth, the care she once showed toward her staff and customers, had faded into a mechanical efficiency. She hadn't noticed the atmosphere shift, or if she had, she'd chosen to ignore it. As she walked past Matt and Jenna, still standing by the register, whispering in low tones, she didn't stop. She didn't address their behavior, the way their laughter seemed to carry a little too far across the room. Nor did she step in when a new employee, a young girl named Lucy, struggled to juggle a tray of orders. Clara simply nodded at her and moved on, as though nothing was out of place. Jonathan could see it now. Clara wasn't just overlooking the problem. She was part of the system that had let it grow. She had become so absorbed in managing the operations, in keeping things running smoothly, that she had lost sight of the people behind it all. She was a manager who cared about numbers, policies, and results, but had forgotten that the heart of any business was the people who worked there and the people they served. He had always admired Clara for her sharp organizational skills, her ability to keep the diner moving during the busiest hours. But now, he saw that her focus on efficiency had allowed the undercurrent of disrespect to flourish unchecked. She hadn't just failed to address the bullying and rudeness among her staff. She had enabled it by turning a blind eye. Jonathan's anger simmered. He had trusted Clara to lead, to set the example. Instead, she had let things slip into a state of indifference. And that realization made his decision all the clearer. He had to act, not just to save the diner, but to save the integrity of what it once stood for. He would confront Clara, make her see what she had missed, and then he would start making the changes that were long overdue. As Jonathan continued to observe, a small flicker of light appeared in the midst of the growing darkness. George, the elderly busboy, moved with quiet precision, clearing tables and wiping down surfaces. Unlike the rest of the staff, he didn't rush. He didn't seem distracted by the chaos of the lunch rush or the cold attitudes of his coworkers. Instead, he worked with a calm steadiness, taking care to make sure every customer felt acknowledged, even if they didn't notice him doing it. Jonathan watched as George greeted the regulars by name, offering them a kind word or a brief moment of connection that made them smile. He spoke to the elderly customers as though they were old friends, always taking the time to ask how their day was going, whether they needed anything, and ensuring they felt valued. It was a level of care Jonathan had hoped to see in every employee, but it seemed that only George still remembered what it meant to treat people like family. At one point, Jonathan saw George approach a young woman who was struggling to carry a tray of food. Without a word, George stepped forward, taking the tray from her and guiding her back to the kitchen with a gentle smile. The young woman thanked him profusely, but George just shrugged it off, his quiet humility evident in the way he handled every task with such grace. As the day went on, Jonathan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for George. In a place where employees seemed focused on their own tasks, their own frustrations, George was the one who still embodied the values Carter's Diner had been built on: kindness, respect, and a genuine desire to serve others. Jonathan knew that George wasn't just a busboy. He was a silent hero, the kind of person who never sought attention or accolades, but made an impact every single day through his actions. And in that moment, Jonathan realized he needed more people like George, not just in the restaurant, but throughout his business. It was time to reclaim the spirit of Carter's Diner, and George was the living reminder of what that spirit looked like. Jonathan had been sitting in the same booth for hours, watching the ebb and flow of the diner. The lunch rush had come and gone, but the tension in the air still lingered. The staff moved through the motions, and Jonathan felt a growing sense of urgency to confront what he had seen. He needed to address the toxic culture, but first, he needed to hear more. His chance came when Clara stepped into the back office, leaving the floor empty for a moment. Matt and Jenna were still near the register, their voices hushed, but loud enough for Jonathan to overhear. He leaned in slightly, pretending to sip his coffee, but his ears were sharp, listening intently to the words that followed. "I can't believe she comes in here acting like she owns the place," Jenna said, her tone dripping with disdain. "I mean, it's just a sandwich shop, right? We don't need to cater to all these people with issues." "Right," Matt agreed, a low chuckle escaping him. "The guy with the walker last week, what was that about? He's not a charity case. Just let him figure it out. I can't stand waiting on people like that." Jonathan's blood ran cold as the words hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just mocking Emily anymore. They were talking about other customers too, treating them like nuisances to be dealt with, not people who deserve care and dignity. He could feel the weight of the truth settle heavily on his chest. "Don't worry about it," Matt continued, his voice lowering. "We just need to keep the numbers up. If Clara keeps focusing on the bottom line, we'll be fine. It's not like she's paying attention to anything else, anyway." Jenna laughed. "She's too busy trying to be a manager to actually manage anything. We'll make sure we cover our tracks. She doesn't even know what's really going on." Jonathan's hands tightened around his coffee cup. He had heard enough. It wasn't just poor service. It was a complete lack of respect, a systemic disregard for the people they were meant to serve. He needed to act, and soon. The time for quiet observation had passed. The moment Jonathan overheard Matt and Jenna's conversation, something inside him shifted. The realization that the problem wasn't isolated, wasn't just a few bad apples, but a culture of entitlement and disrespect settled in his gut like a stone. His heart raced, not just with anger, but with a deep sense of responsibility. He had spent years building this business, crafting a community where everyone, staff and customers alike, was treated with dignity. And now he saw how far that vision had slipped. He couldn't let it continue. This was no longer just about firing a few employees. It was about restoring the values that had built Carter's Diner from the ground up. But where to begin? The moment felt like a turning point. He had heard the laughter, the mockery. He had seen the indifference in Clara, his trusted manager. And now, he realized that change had to start with him. Jonathan spent the rest of the afternoon in quiet contemplation. He watched George, the busboy, move through the diner, his actions steady and kind, even as the rest of the staff seemed to race past him. It was impossible to ignore the contrast. George was a man who understood what Carter's Diner was supposed to be, a place of warmth, of respect, of connection. And yet, he was the exception in a sea of apathy. Jonathan's decision was made. He would confront the staff, every single one of them. He would address the culture he had allowed to grow unchecked. And he would begin with Matt and Jenna. They were the loudest voices, the ones who had openly mocked customers, but they weren't the only ones. They were just the most blatant example of what had become a norm. But Jonathan knew that the confrontation couldn't be about punishment alone. It had to be about change. He needed to make his staff see what had gone wrong, help them understand that respect for others was more important than speed, efficiency, or profits. Carter's Diner could still be the place he had dreamed of, but only if he was willing to fight for it, and fight hard. Today, the fight began. Jonathan knew that the truth, while painfully obvious to him, needed to be shown in undeniable clarity. He couldn't rely on just his observations. He needed concrete evidence to expose the depth of the issue. If he was going to restore the integrity of Carter's Diner, he would need to confront the staff with irrefutable proof of the toxic culture that had taken root. The next day, Jonathan arrived earlier than usual, before the lunch rush. He set up his own small corner of the diner, seated just far enough to observe without drawing attention. He made sure the cameras, discreetly placed by the staff over the past few days, were set up properly. They wouldn't be visible, but they would record every interaction, every moment of cruelty, every slight. As the staff trickled in, Jonathan kept his presence minimal, appearing as just another regular customer, though the weight of what he was about to uncover weighed heavily on him. He had made calls to a security company and arranged for hidden cameras to be installed throughout the diner, including the registers and the kitchen. The goal wasn't just to catch Matt and Jenna in the act. It was to show that this kind of behavior had infected every corner of the business, including management. For hours, he watched quietly. The interactions were subtle at first. Matt, who had been flippant in his earlier conversations, now seemed more careful. But there was still the same tone in his voice when he spoke to customers he deemed difficult. Jenna, too, was more guarded, but Jonathan caught glimpses of the same behavior. Dismissive glances, mocking whispers. At one point, Jonathan saw Clara, the manager, walking through the diner, oblivious to the atmosphere around her. She smiled and greeted customers, but there was no warmth in her words, no real engagement. Jonathan's heart sank. Clara had failed to recognize the subtle shifts in behavior, the erosion of trust. The cameras were now his only witness, capturing everything that had slipped past his attention for far too long. Jonathan knew that what he was about to expose would shake everything, but it was the only way forward. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The weight of what Jonathan had seen over the last few days was beginning to feel unbearable. The evidence from the hidden cameras painted a clear picture, one that revealed not just the employees' cruelty, but also the deeper issue of indifference. It wasn't just Matt and Jenna. It was Clara, too. It was the way she ignored the mounting problems, how she looked the other way when customers were humiliated or mistreated. Jonathan had never imagined that the woman he had trusted to uphold the standards of the diner could be so blind to the decay of the culture she was supposed to nurture. As he sat in his booth, watching the slow rhythm of the afternoon unfold, Jonathan found himself torn. He had gathered all the evidence he needed, and yet something inside him hesitated. The confrontation was inevitable, but he wasn't sure how to approach it. Should he expose the staff's actions directly, lay everything out in front of them, or should he pull back and try to guide them toward change? Jonathan's mind raced. There were so many layers to this conflict. There was the anger he felt toward Matt and Jenna, who had mocked those who were most vulnerable. There was his disappointment in Clara, who had failed to notice the shift in atmosphere and, by extension, the failure of her leadership. And then there was his own failure. The realization that he had been so consumed by expansion, by profits, that he hadn't seen what was happening right under his nose. But what really unsettled him was the question of how to address this issue without destroying what he had worked so hard to build. He couldn't just fire the staff and hope it would all work itself out. That wouldn't solve the deeper problem, the toxic culture that had silently grown within the walls of Carter's Diner. He had to confront it head-on, not just as a CEO, but as someone who believed in the values the diner had once stood for. But was he ready to make that call? Would the damage be too great to repair? The conflict raged inside him, and for the first time, Jonathan wasn't sure of what came next. Jonathan could feel the tension building, not just in the air around him, but in his own chest. Every day he returned to Carter's Diner, he saw more signs of the unraveling. The laughter, the mocking, the cold indifference. It had become too much to ignore. It wasn't just the few employees who were blatantly disrespecting the customers. It was the entire culture that had started to settle in. No one seemed to care about the diners anymore, not in the way they had once cared. That afternoon, the breaking point came when a young mother with 2 small children entered the diner. Jonathan had seen her before. She came in once a week, always polite, always careful with her money. She ordered a small meal for herself and a kid's menu for her children, but as she approached the register to pay, her face fell. Jonathan could tell immediately that something was wrong. "Sorry, I thought I had enough," the woman said softly, opening her wallet. "I think I'm short by a few dollars. Can I leave the tip this time and come back later to pay?" Megan, the cashier, didn't even look up from the register. "You should have checked before you ordered," she snapped, voice cold. "We don't have time to make exceptions." The woman's face flushed with embarrassment, and her children looked at her, confused and concerned. It was a moment of vulnerability, of struggle, and instead of compassion, it was met with disdain. Jonathan could feel the anger rising in him. He had heard the stories, seen the footage, but this was the final straw. As the woman awkwardly began to apologize, Jonathan stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He could feel every eye in the diner turn toward him, but he didn't care. He walked over to the register and interrupted the scene with a sharp, steady voice. "Hold on," he said, addressing Megan, but his eyes were fixed on the woman. "I've got this." He reached into his wallet and handed the cashier the difference, paying for the woman's meal. His gaze never left Megan's, the weight of his disapproval heavy in the air. "Are you going to treat every customer like this?" Jonathan's voice was quiet but lethal. The breaking point had arrived. The diner fell silent. Jonathan's words hung in the air, thick with tension. The woman's relief was palpable, her embarrassment slowly fading as she thanked him, and Jonathan smiled in return, his attention now fully on the staff. He had made his move. There was no turning back. "Thank you," the woman said softly, taking her children's hands and hurrying out of the diner, but Jonathan barely noticed. His focus remained on the staff, who were still processing what had just transpired. The silence was broken by the clatter of dishes being cleared away. Jonathan's eyes shifted to Matt and Jenna, who were still standing at the register, their faces pale and their postures tense. They knew, as well as he did, that something had shifted. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the culture they had allowed to fester unchecked. Jonathan stepped toward them, his voice low but sharp. "You think you can treat people like that and not face consequences?" The air in the diner grew heavier. Clara, who had been hovering near the kitchen, walked toward Jonathan, but she didn't speak. She stood there, her face a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. She had been too focused on keeping the business running smoothly, turning a blind eye to the undercurrents of disrespect among her staff. Now, she saw the consequences of her failure to act. "I don't know what's going on with you two," Jonathan continued, his gaze unwavering, "but this is not how we do things here. Carter's Diner was built on respect, on kindness, and you've forgotten that." Matt opened his mouth to speak, but Jonathan cut him off, his voice firm and final. "You're both done here. Effective immediately." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Jenna's face flushed with anger, but there was nothing she could say. Matt, too, seemed to understand that his actions had finally caught up with him. Jonathan turned to Clara next, his tone softer, but no less resolute. "This is your responsibility, Clara. You failed your team and these customers. I don't know if you can fix this, but you'd better start trying." The reckoning had begun, and Jonathan was ready to follow through on his promise to make things right. The atmosphere in the diner was thick with anticipation, the tension hanging heavy in the air as Jonathan stood before the remaining staff. The confrontation had only just begun, but he knew the time for subtlety was over. It was time to lay everything out on the table, to address the festering issue that had poisoned his beloved diner. Clara stood near the kitchen, her arms crossed, her face a mixture of confusion and regret. Matt and Jenna, still stung by their firing, glared at him from the far end of the counter, but Jonathan could see the fear in their eyes. They knew this wasn't just about losing their jobs. It was about something far bigger. This was a reckoning for all of them. Jonathan's gaze swept across the room, meeting each employee's eyes. "I've been watching," he began, his voice calm but filled with quiet authority. "For the last few days, I've been here, observing. Not as the owner, but as a customer. And what I've seen disgusts me." There was no need to elaborate. The footage from the cameras spoke for itself. He had seen it all. The laughter, the mockery, the complete lack of empathy for the very people who kept the diner running. It was a betrayal of the values he had built Carter's Diner on. "You too," he nodded toward Matt and Jenna. "Think it's funny to make fun of people who are struggling, to belittle them because they're different or in need. You're wrong, and you're fired." He didn't flinch when they reacted, their faces contorting in anger and shame. He had expected this. But this wasn't about their feelings. It was about showing every person in that diner that actions had consequences. Turning to Clara, Jonathan's voice softened, but the disappointment was clear. "And you, as the manager, It was your responsibility to foster an environment of respect. You've allowed this to happen, and I can't ignore that. I need someone who understands what it means to lead, not just manage. Clara's face reddened, but she didn't argue. Jonathan knew it was over for her, too. He could feel it deep in his chest, the weight of the decision he'd made. But it was the right one. The reckoning was just the beginning of the change he would see through to the end. The shockwave rippled through the diner. No one spoke as Jonathan's words settled in, heavy and undeniable. The firing of Matt and Jenna was unexpected, but it was the quiet authority in Jonathan's voice, the firm resolve, that made it clear this wasn't just about them. This was about something much deeper. It was about the values Carter's Diner had once stood for and the devastation that had been wrought by those who had forgotten it. Matt and Jenna stood frozen for a moment, their eyes wide with disbelief. Neither of them had expected to be called out, let alone fired. For a brief second, they seemed unsure of what to do next, as if they couldn't quite process what had just happened. Then, in a rush of anger, Matt spat out a string of curses, his voice shaking with frustration. "You can't fire me. You need me here." Jenna, ever the quieter one, just stared at Jonathan, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and resentment. But there was no argument to be had. Jonathan was done. "I've seen enough," Jonathan said, his tone unyielding. "You both want to play games with people's dignity. It's not going to happen here. Not on my watch." The room remained eerily silent, the air thick with the weight of the confrontation. Clara, who had been standing quietly by, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. She seemed to shrink under Jonathan's gaze, her earlier confidence lost. The regulars in the diner exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of what to do or say. For years, they had come to Carter's Diner because it felt like home, a place where they were treated like family. Now, they were watching as the very fabric of that familiarity unraveled. Some seemed relieved, others uneasy, but no one moved. Jonathan felt a strange mix of anger and sadness. He had to do this, but the sting of it still hit him hard. His eyes swept the room once more, and he finally spoke again, his voice steady but firm. "Starting tomorrow, this place is changing, and I'm not asking for your approval. I'm demanding your respect." The shockwave had passed, but its ripple effect had only just begun. This wasn't just about a few employees. It was about every person who had ever walked through those doors. And Jonathan would make sure the diner returned to what it was always meant to be. The silence in the diner felt like a weight pressing down on everyone. Jonathan stood tall, his gaze steady as he watched Matt and Jenna gather their things, their faces a mixture of anger and disbelief. Neither of them spoke, but their body language screamed defiance. They were humiliated, and that humiliation burned in their eyes. They had thought they could get away with their behavior, that no one would challenge them. But now, in front of the entire staff, they were being exposed. Clara stood frozen by the kitchen door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't look at Jonathan, her gaze fixed somewhere on the floor. The truth of the situation was starting to settle in. She hadn't seen the full extent of what had been happening around her, and now that it was laid bare, she wasn't sure how to react. She had been a manager for years, but now, in the face of this stark reality, she felt small. The diner's regulars watched in quiet discomfort. Some of them had seen the tension between the staff and knew something was off, but this was more than they had expected. The firing of Matt and Jenna wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a public unraveling of the culture Jonathan had allowed to deteriorate. "Get your things," Jonathan said to Matt and Jenna, his voice sharp. There was no pity in his tone. "And don't come back." Matt's face flushed red, his fists clenched at his sides. "You'll regret this," he muttered under his breath, storming out the door without looking back. Jenna followed closely behind, her head down, her shoulders hunched as if trying to shrink herself into the shadows. The door slammed behind them, leaving the diner in an uncomfortable stillness. Jonathan turned toward Clara, his gaze hard but not unkind. "I expect better from you. We're going to have a conversation about what's next. But right now, I need you to step up and fix this." Clara nodded slowly, the weight of the moment finally settling on her. Jonathan took a deep breath, then addressed the remaining staff. "The culture here is changing, starting today. I won't tolerate disrespect, not toward customers, not toward each other, and not from anyone." The immediate consequence had been delivered, but it was only the beginning of the reckoning. Jonathan knew the real work was just starting. The aftermath of the confrontation hung heavily in the air. The diner, once full of the usual hum of activity, now felt like a place frozen in time. The energy had shifted, but no one knew how to react. The remaining staff shuffled about, cleaning tables and taking orders with mechanical precision, their eyes darting nervously between Jonathan and each other. Clara, though she had not been fired, felt the weight of Jonathan's words as if they were a judgment she couldn't escape. Jonathan sat quietly at his booth, watching the scene unfold. He knew this moment of silence wouldn't last. Change was inevitable, but it had to start from within. He had disrupted the routine, challenged the comfort zone of the staff, and now the ripple effects were impossible to ignore. A few regulars who had witnessed the scene still lingered, awkwardly finishing their meals, casting glances toward Jonathan but unsure how to respond. He caught the eye of one elderly man who had been coming to the diner for years. The man nodded in approval, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was the only recognition Jonathan needed in that moment. The customers, at least, understood that something needed to be done. The staff, however, had yet to come to terms with it. Clara approached Jonathan after the lunch rush had passed, her steps slow and hesitant. She stood at the edge of his booth, unsure of what to say. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice shaky. "I didn't realize how bad it had gotten." Jonathan looked up at her, the weight of his disappointment still clear in his eyes. "You didn't see it because you weren't looking. You've been too focused on the wrong things. This place isn't about efficiency or profits. It's about people." Clara nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and determination. "I'll do better," she said, her voice steady now. "I'll fix this." Jonathan didn't respond right away, but as Clara walked back to the kitchen, he knew that the real work was about to begin. There was much to rebuild, and it wouldn't be easy, but it had to be done. The changes had to go deeper than just the surface. It was about restoring the heart of Carter's diner, and he was determined to see it through. The diner had quieted after the storm of the confrontation, but Jonathan knew the silence wasn't just from the staff. The customers, too, were waiting for something, an explanation, a reassurance that the environment they had come to love hadn't been lost forever. Jonathan couldn't ignore the need to address them. It was his responsibility, not just as the owner, but as the person who had let this situation go on for far too long. As the afternoon shifted into evening, he stood up from his booth, the quiet buzz of conversation continuing around him. His steps were deliberate, purposeful, as he made his way to the front of the diner. The clink of silverware and the hum of the kitchen fell away as Jonathan took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. Every pair of eyes was on him now, waiting. "Everyone," he began, his voice steady but carrying through the room. "I owe you an apology. To those of you who've been coming here for years, to those of you who've made this diner a part of your lives, thank you. But more than that, I owe you an apology for what has been happening here behind the scenes for longer than I care to admit." The room fell still, and Jonathan could see the surprise in their eyes. This wasn't a man used to making excuses, and they hadn't expected him to speak at all. But the weight of what had transpired was undeniable. "I've allowed a culture of disrespect to take root here," he continued, his voice growing firmer. "I've let staff treat customers in ways that are unacceptable, and I didn't see it until now. I want you all to know that this will change. From here on out, Carter's Diner will be a place where kindness, respect, and integrity are the only standards we hold ourselves to." A murmur of approval spread through the crowd. Jonathan nodded, his gaze softening. "I can't undo the mistakes of the past, but I can promise that we'll do better. You deserve better, and I will make sure we deliver on that every day." He paused, letting the words settle in. The room felt lighter now, a small ripple of hope replacing the tension that had filled it earlier. Jonathan returned to his seat, the first step of healing having been made. The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of reflection and action. Jonathan knew the firing of Matt and Jenna, along with his stern talk with Clara, was just the beginning. The real challenge lay in uncovering the depth of the problem within Carter's diner. He had seen enough to know that disrespect had become ingrained, but he couldn't fix what he didn't fully understand. Determined to uncover the full scope of the issues, Jonathan began an investigation. This time, it wasn't about just watching from the sidelines. It was about listening, digging deeper into the heart of the diner's operations and its culture. He made subtle inquiries, speaking with employees, those still there and those who had left, and listening to the customers more closely than ever before. The first thing Jonathan did was sit down with George, the busboy who had stood out as a beacon of decency amidst the chaos. George had been there longer than anyone, seen it all. Jonathan asked him for his perspective, trying to understand how things had gotten so bad. "I've been here a long time." George began slowly, his hands rough from years of work, and it wasn't always like this. There used to be a lot more pride in our work. We treated customers like family, not just for tips, but because it was the right thing to do. He paused, his gaze distant. But after the new management took over, it felt like it was all about speed and numbers. The people, the customers, they got lost in the rush. Jonathan listened, nodding. George wasn't the only one who had expressed concern, but his words crystallized the problem. The focus had shifted from hospitality to efficiency, and somewhere along the way, the staff had adopted the same mentality. The more Jonathan spoke with others, current employees, former ones, and regular customers, the clearer it became that the diner had lost its way. The damage had been subtle at first, small moments of disregard that had grown into a pervasive atmosphere. The investigation was just beginning, but Jonathan knew it was time to take the next step. He had to rebuild this place, brick by brick, starting with understanding exactly where things had gone wrong. The first signs of change were small, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But to Jonathan, they were the first flickers of light breaking through the dark cloud that had hung over Carter's diner for far too long. The shift didn't happen overnight, but it started with the subtle shifts in behavior, the small gestures that spoke volumes about the new direction the diner was heading. It began with Clara. After her conversation with Jonathan, she had taken it to heart. She had spent years focused on efficiency, on profits, and on keeping the wheels of the business turning. But now, she was starting to notice what had been missing. She made more of an effort to connect with the staff, to ask how they were doing, to encourage them to take pride in their work. Jonathan could see it in the way she interacted with customers now. Slower, more thoughtful, offering smiles that weren't just forced, but genuine. The rest of the staff followed suit, if hesitantly at first. George, the quiet busboy who had been a constant presence throughout all the turmoil, became more involved in training the newer employees. He had a quiet authority about him, one that came not from a position of power, but from the respect he had earned by simply doing his job with dignity. Slowly, the newer staff began to mimic his attitude, taking more care in their tasks, treating customers with more respect, and, most importantly, showing signs of genuine care in their work. Jonathan had asked Clara to implement weekly team meetings, where they could discuss issues, celebrate successes, and focus on improving the overall culture. It wasn't just about the work, it was about the people, and slowly, as the weeks passed, he saw the results. The employees weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were engaging with their customers, taking pride in their work, and looking out for one another. Customers began to notice, too. They could feel the difference. The diner was no longer just a place to eat. It had become, once again, a place to feel welcome, to feel like you mattered. The positive shift had begun, and Jonathan felt a renewed sense of hope. The diner was starting to find its way back. Rebuilding the team wasn't going to be easy. Jonathan knew that. Trust had been broken, both within the staff and with the customers. But as the days passed and the atmosphere at Carter's diner slowly improved, he realized it wasn't about just fixing what had been broken. It was about building something new, something stronger. The first step was having an honest conversation with Clara. She had started to see the changes in herself and her team. But Jonathan knew that to truly transform the culture, they needed more than just small adjustments. They needed to start fresh, bringing in new people who understood the values they were trying to instill. Clara, Jonathan began one morning after the lunch rush. I need you to lead this team, but we need to expand it. It's not just about finding more staff. It's about finding the right people. People who believe in what we're trying to do here. Clara nodded, her eyes focused, her expression more determined than it had been in weeks. I get it. We need a shift in attitude across the board. We'll start by rethinking the hiring process. We need people who care not just about the job, but about the people we serve. Together, they began the process of carefully selecting new team members, making sure that every person they hired shared the same values Jonathan was working so hard to rebuild. The interviews weren't just about experience. They were about empathy, communication, and a genuine desire to make the diner a place where both customers and staff felt valued. At the same time, Jonathan worked with the existing team, offering training on customer service, conflict resolution, and teamwork. The new hires, brought in with the understanding that they were joining a team in transition, quickly saw that this wasn't just about doing the job. It was about being part of something larger. The result wasn't instant, but it was real. The team started to gel, not just as co-workers, but as a group united by a common purpose. They began to trust one another again, building a foundation that was stronger than before. Carter's Diner wasn't just a restaurant. It was a place of respect, and Jonathan was determined to make sure it stayed that way. The first sign that Carter's Diner was on the road to recovery came in the form of a quiet morning. The diner's regulars, those who had once filled the booths with laughter and conversation, started trickling back through the doors. At first, it was just a few familiar faces, the ones who had watched the diner grow from a modest establishment to the local landmark it had become. They came in cautiously, unsure of what to expect, but eager to see if the changes Jonathan had promised were real. Jonathan was there every day, greeting customers, checking in with the staff, and quietly observing the transformation. Clara, with her renewed focus, was by his side, ensuring every aspect of service was executed with care. The new hires, eager to prove themselves, worked hard to keep the standard high. But it was the small things that began to matter the most. The genuine smiles, the extra effort, the warm greetings that were once second nature, now coming back with purpose. By midweek, the regulars started coming back more frequently, drawn by the change in the atmosphere. They saw it in the way the staff engaged with them, in how the tables were cleared with more care, in the way the food was served with a personal touch. The diner no longer felt like just a place to eat. It felt like a place to belong again. One afternoon, as Jonathan wiped down a table, he noticed a family of four walk in. They were new faces, unfamiliar to the diner, but they sat down with a confidence that spoke volumes. They ordered with ease, laughing among themselves as they dug into their meals. Jonathan watched them closely, a quiet satisfaction growing in him. They didn't know about the old Carter's Diner, the one with the lack of warmth, the one tainted by neglect and disrespect. But they would know a new diner now, one that treated everyone with care, regardless of who they were. And with that, Jonathan knew the most important thing had happened. The customers were coming back, not just out of habit, but because they trusted that Carter's Diner was once again a place they could call home. It was a quiet morning at Carter's Diner, the kind of peaceful start to the day Jonathan had been hoping for. The sun streamed in through the windows, casting a warm glow over the newly cleaned tables. The hum of the kitchen was steady, the clink of silverware and soft chatter between the staff, a gentle reminder that the diner had found its rhythm again. Jonathan stood by the counter, watching the early crowd settle in. The regulars had returned, and new faces were becoming more frequent. The diner, which had once felt like a place on the brink of losing its soul, now radiated a sense of belonging. Every person in the room, whether they were a customer or an employee, could feel the difference. There was a new energy, a renewed commitment to kindness, respect, and community. Clara walked by, a cup of coffee in hand, and offered Jonathan a small smile. She looked more confident than she had in weeks, her movements purposeful as she checked on the staff. The team, now united and committed to the changes, worked with a sense of pride. They no longer rushed through their tasks. They engaged with their customers, learned their names, and took the time to make every interaction meaningful. Jonathan knew that the work wasn't over. The diner was still evolving, still finding its true balance, but it had taken its first steps towards something stronger. He'd seen the transformation in Clara, in the staff, and in the customers. It was a slow burn, but it was steady. He had built this place on a foundation of respect, and now, with the mistakes of the past behind them, they could build something even better. As Jonathan watched a new group of customers enter, laughing and chatting as they made their way to their seats, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The diner was no longer just a business. It was a living, breathing part of the community once again. He turned back to the counter, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. This was only the beginning. Carter's diner had come through the storm, and now it was stronger than ever. And Jonathan, more than ever, was ready for whatever came next.